But welcome everyone to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whatever you believe, whoever you love, you are welcome here. This is our religious scholarship and literacy course for adult religious education. Lecture 29. This is an introduction to the Book of Deuteronomy. And my name is James Carroll. I am a religious educator here, and I used to teach comparative religion and Bible at Brigham Young University before I came here and became a Unitarian. So that's my background on what we're doing here. This is part of a larger lecture series. There is a course webpage, sites.google.com, view biblical scholarship and literacy. There's a syllabus and a calendar, and I will say that I finally updated some of this. The syllabus is a little bit late. It doesn't have all the links to things it should have, but the calendar at least is there. It tells you when the next class is, and there's a link to the last class I taught and information about this class, and I'll try to update that again tonight, so that'll stay updated for you, and you can find stuff if you're watching online. And I also built this little QR code, so that link will be in the video description if you're watching online. But if you're here or you're watching online, you can take a picture of this, and your phone should take you to the site, and it should be easier to find your way there. Everyone's doing it, so I thought I'd try it. Like I said, the calendar's updated. The next class should be we'll get to that. I need to get the date out from another place. So here's what we're going to do today. I want to review the story so far, so we know where we're at when we start Deuteronomy. I want to give an introduction to the book, where we'll talk about an outline of the text, the name of the book, what Deuteronomy means. It's kind of a funny name, what it means, where it comes from. And then I want to talk about some major themes of the book, talk about authorship, and then we'll hit the documentary hypothesis again, one more time. But for the first time, we'll have all of the authors. D is an author we have not seen until now, so that last author in the documentary hypothesis will be added to our list of authors and sources, and we can discuss it in full now that we've seen D. We'll also then talk about Josiah and the finding of that book of the law in the temple, and we'll talk about what that might or might not have to do with the book of Deuteronomy itself, and how those things are connected. We'll do some conclusions, discuss what is this book then, after all that we've seen, and then we'll discuss what we'll do next time. Next time, we'll go through some of the contents of the book. So today we're going to talk about, the authorship, the source, the themes, and the next time we will read specific passages from the book. So last time, we've covered the Exodus. We've got ourselves to Sinai, where they're given the law. They build the temple, or the tabernacle. They wander through the wilderness to the north, and they come to the River Jordan. They send some spies into the land who come back and say, the land is great, but it's full of giants and really scary people, and we can't conquer this land. And, even with God's help, we'll never succeed. We might as well give up and go back to Egypt. And God, of course, naturally, because this is the Old Testament, becomes really angry with the people and says, well, I'll just kill them all and start over with you, Moses. And Moses says, no, please don't do that. Forgive them. And he says, okay, well, we'll just make them wander for 40 more years. That generation will die out. We'll get a new generation of Israelites. They'll be willing to serve me, and they'll go into the promised land. So that begins the 40 years of wandering, where we have the brazen serpent and water from the rock, which is what we covered last time. And that's kind of was our conclusion to the book of Numbers. One other element of Numbers, which we didn't cover in too much detail, was the conquest. They conquered the east side of the River Jordan in the book of Numbers. So the book of Numbers concludes with the people on the east side of Jordan having conquered the east side, ready to pass into the west side, the true promised land. And Moses, remember, because he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, according to one of the sources, is supposed to die before he ever gets to go into the promised land. And so this is before Moses dies, but before they go into the promised land, which is in kind of 1 month time where Deuteronomy sits. Right between the conquest of the east side, the conquest of the west side in Joshua, we get the interjection of the book of Deuteronomy with a whole new generation of Israelites. So what is the book? Well, it is 3 speeches of Moses whereby he encourages the new generation to enter a covenant with God. Because the old generation, they made a covenant with God at Sinai. They're all dead. And so now a new generation has to make a covenant with God. So that's the context. 3 speeches of Moses wherein he convinces this new generation to make a covenant with God. There is a a third-person prologue, which sets the stage. These are our three speeches, and then there's kind of a postlogue at the end. The postlogue does have some material from Moses in it, but for the most part, it's again a third-person conclusion to the book. So there's a third-person introduction, a third-person conclusion. In between, there are these three speeches of Moses, and it's all about getting this new generation to make a covenant with God. The book is named Deuteronomy in English. It's kind of a funny word, so what does that mean? It means deuto, it's Greek, it's Latin from the Greek, deuto, repetition of the law. So the book means the repetition of the law in Latin from the Greek. The Greek is here, and it's, deuteronomoi. My Greek is poor, but I can still do this. Deuteronomoi. And that's the Greek name for the Greek translation. You remember that the Hebrew Bible was originally in Hebrew, but then it was translated into Greek after Alexander conquered the world, and the whole world became Greek-speaking, so it was translated in Greek. The Greek translation, called the Septuagint, was highly influential, and that is the source of the Greek name for the book Deuteronomy. Go ahead.
Is it, I have heard that because it was translated from Hebrew to Greek, that there were some misinterpretations.
So we still have the Hebrew and we have the Greek. The Greek became the Old Testament for the New Testament writers, and so when they quote the Old Testament, they will quote the Greek. And sometimes the Greek translation isn't quite right. When we have the Hebrew, we'll look at it and go, well, that's probably a mistranslation in the Greek, and they will interpret it according to that Greek translation, and sometimes in ways that aren't consistent with the older Hebrew. So that's a thing that happens. It mostly impacts the New Testament. But again, we still have the Hebrew, so we can kind of tell it. Yeah. Now, sometimes the Greek translation is useful because the Hebrew has been copied and copied and copied, and once in a while we'll get a Greek translation that we think is closer to correct than the Hebrew because we think the Hebrew has a typo or something like this. So the Greek is a good second witness because they branched at an early date, and so it's a witness of what the text looked like back when they branched.
That really helps.
There's also an important translation in Aramaic called the Targum, which is important, and so there's several fairly important translations, and then there's the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is an early witness to the Hebrew. Again, from a different tradition though than the Hebrew that we have. Called the Masoretic text or the received text went through a slightly different set of hands than the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So not only are the Dead Sea Scrolls older, it's an older copy of the Hebrew, but they have a different textual tradition. So that's a side point, but I think it's useful.
Possibly able to agree.
Do the translations agree? Yes, the overall story is very similar, but every once in a while you get one or two passages that you can't quite make sense of, and there they will disagree. In fact, one of them is in Deuteronomy, and we plan to cover it next month. There is a passage in Deuteronomy that is very difficult to figure out what it means, and we'll go through the different translations and the different text, not just translations, but the textual traditions, the Septuagint versus the Masoretic text versus the Dead Sea Scrolls, and try to figure out what the original was, and then try to figure out why it got changed and how it got changed and things like that. So this happens, but the main story is very much the same in all of these. So this is the meaning of the book. The Hebrew is devarim, and that means the words. And it also very much fits. These are the words which Moses spake. It comes from the first line of the text. These are the words which Moses spake before the children of Israel went into the promised land, from chapter 1, verse 1. The word Deuteronomy in the Greek shows up once in the text, but it's not until chapter 17. And there we get when he has taken the throne, he being the king. When the king has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law, a repetition of this law, a Deuteronomy. So in Greek, there we have the word Deuteronomy in the text. But it mostly means something a little different than this copy of the law that the king keeps. It's the repetition of the law by Moses so it fits in several nice ways.
Does it also include the word litany?
I don't think so.
Okay.
As I understand, a litany would be
repeating the same thing over and over again.
It's something you repeat or say usually in ritual context. This is a second repetition of the law. And in this case, it's Moses recounting in past tense what happened. He retells the whole story of the Exodus. He says, he'll tell you, I did this, and I led you out of Egypt, and we went through the wilderness, and this happened to us, and this happened to us. And we made a covenant with God. Please keep that covenant. That's basically that's a very good. Oh, and if you don't keep the covenant, you'll be punished. That's a summary of sort of the speeches Moses gives. Interestingly enough, there are differences, which is, again, why we think this is a different tradition, because their reminiscence of what happened in the wilderness is slightly different than what we saw in the other parts of the text. We'll talk about some of those. Covenant, so the main things, covenant and devotion to God. Keep the covenant. You're going to, again, this is a new generation. Make the covenant like the old generation did, and keep it. Main theme, keep the covenant. So love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Deuteronomy 6:4 is very famous because Jesus listed it as the most important commandment. I should point out, though, that in this context, love the Lord, we think of love as a warm, fuzzy feeling you're supposed to have for God. This is part of the covenant language of the text, and in this context, it probably means something a lot more like be utterly devoted. It's a devotion that leads to obedience. But obedience is the goal, but the devotion is the thing that from which the obedience swells from your heart. You're just like you would be patriotic to the United States, therefore you would obey the United States. This would be patriotic to the nation of Israel and Israel's God. Therefore you're devoted to it. Therefore you keep the commandments and do what's right. It's listed in a Caesarean treaty format. That is a fancy scholar's word for a format of treaties we see in the ancient Near East between a king and their sort of vassal states. We'll talk about Caesarean treaty format in much more detail later. And the book is replete with this idea of the presence of the past in the present, and the present and the past in the present. So, sorry, I said that wrong. The presence of the past and the past in the present. In other words, the present is moved back into the past, and the past is moved up into the present. And so there's this fluidity of time, which is a major theme of the text. And we'll talk about that too. And again, keep the laws, you'll be blessed. Violate the laws, you'll be cursed. And then also the centralization of worship in Jerusalem. This is a main theme of the text, and it is not the sort of thing we see in E, for example. E is a source from the north, and from his perspective, you can worship God anywhere. Of course, because he didn't live in Jerusalem. D probably lived in Jerusalem and wanted to centralize worship in Jerusalem. And so D makes a big deal about it being wrong to sacrifice to God in places other than at Jerusalem. Okay, so let's talk about this treaty format, since the Book of Deuteronomy matches this treaty format. A Caesarean treaty format is a treaty between a king, like a monarch, and a vassal state, meaning another king. Usually it's a treaty between two kings, but one kingdom has conquered the other. And so these are usually unequal treaty formats, so a treaty between an overlord and its master. And it has these parts: the identification of the parties, which is the preamble, and the history. The history is sort of when they come along and say, this is what I've done for you. I've taken care of you. I've protected you. I've brought armies to defend your borders. Therefore, you should follow these stipulations. Pay your taxes, keep the commandments, don't murder, kill, because I take care of you. I'm your king. I take care of you. In return, you will keep these rules. And then, to make sure you keep the rules, we will deposit this covenant, and we will periodically bring it out and read it so that you'll be reminded. There will be witnesses to the covenant, and then there will be used often gods or sometimes other kings or the rulers, and there are blessings and cursings for obedience or disobedience. If you disobey, you will be punished. If you obey, you will be blessed. It's very transactional. We'll discuss transactional nature in a bit. I have a handout for this. I also have this QR code, and I'll put it in the video description. And all this is a PDF where I've scanned a couple early guild initiation documents, which give you an idea of this treaty format, and you can read this after, right? So you can go home and read these if you'd like. But these are these early guild initiation documents, along with a copy of some Hittite treaties that you can look at from the late Bronze period, and you can see how similar they are to what we find in the Book of Deuteronomy. But the most similar one is the Assyrian treaties of Esarhaddon. And in this case, they all have this format that we've just described. I should point out the guild initiations is fascinating because it seems relevant for things like modern guild initiations like fraternities and Freemasonry that also follow this pattern. But we have these texts from very early times in Mesopotamia that have some of the same pattern to them. All right, sorry, that's a side note, but I did give a lecture many years ago on Freemasonry where we went through those guild initiations, same handout as before, in detail. So again, there's the handout. You can follow the QR code, and the link will be in the video description. But the Assyrian Treaty of Esarhaddon is fascinating because Esarhaddon lived in the late 7th century. He was a problem for Israel. The Assyrians had a tendency to conquer lots of other places, and when they did, they were known for intense cruelty. They would skewer people alive on these poles, and they liked to draw pictures of it. In fact, they were proud of their war crimes because this would cause people to surrender to them rather than fight. Because if you surrender, they don't do this to you. If you fight them, they do this to you. If you surrender, not only do they not hang you up like this, they will protect you. You have to pay taxes, it's true, but then in return, you get the protection of the Assyrian army. And your other enemies will think twice about invading your nation because the Assyrians will be on your side. So it was a real temptation. If you were living in Jerusalem and the Assyrian army was camped outside, you kind of would be tempted to say, let's surrender, because the opposite of surrender is I get stuck on this pole. And if I do surrender, I have to pay a little bit of taxes, but dang it, I get the Assyrian protection. It's worth it. Let's surrender. It's a temptation. This is relevant to the Book of Deuteronomy because the suzerain treaties of Esarhaddon actually not only borrow the structure that we saw in the Hittite treaties and all these other treaties, but they also have the same verbiage. There is word usage overlap between the Assyrian treaty of Esarhaddon and the books of Deuteronomy. So there is a connection between the two. Probably a connection of dating. This might help us figure out when the book was written. Some people might believe that there is a direct dependence, that the book of Deuteronomy is directly dependent on whoever wrote it had the Treaty of Esarhaddon sitting there in front of him. Others just believe that this was in the air at the time it was written. But either way, that dates the book of Deuteronomy as being around this time period. So, let's look at authorship. So we've got that gives us some clue about authorship, right? That it's connected to the treaties of Esarhaddon in some way. Okay. The idea that it was written by Moses is a rather late tradition. It's tradition. People often say when we challenge the idea of Mosaic authorship for the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Law of Moses is called. When you challenge Mosaic authorship, people will often say you're criticizing the Bible, you're challenging the Bible. But the Bible never says that's the authorship, that you're challenging a late tradition about the text, and you're doing it by taking the text seriously. Because the text itself does not say it was written by Moses. The text says something entirely different. What does the book of Deuteronomy, as a separate text from the rest of the book, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy is something different. As its own thing, it's been combined later, but as its own book, what does it say about its authorship? Well, let's read. This is Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1. These are the words, the Devarim, this is the Hebrew word, title of the book. The words that Moses spoke to Israel beyond Jordan, in the wilderness, in the plains opposite of Suaf, between Paran and Tophel Leban, Hazeroth and Dizabah. And I slaughtered those names. And in fact, I believe we don't know where a lot of those places are. But we know a couple things. When Moses is buried, he is buried at a place called Mount Nebo, which is right here. And the text says, notice what it says, these are the words Moses spoke beyond Jordan. So, from the perspective of whoever wrote this, Moses said these things on the other side of the Jordan from where this guy lived. Moses didn't speak them on the other side of the Jordan from himself, And Moses probably didn't talk about himself in the third person this way. This is someone saying, I'm telling you about what Moses said way over there. But I live over here, probably in Jerusalem, given the centralization of worship in Jerusalem that is the theme of the book. So the text itself says it's written by somebody else, and it tells us where that person lived, on the other side of the Jordan from when Moses gave this speech. It also tells us a little bit about when he lived. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died. So this is again, there's a third person introduction and a third person conclusion. This is from the third person conclusion. Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. Notice, Moses did not write about his death in the third person in the past tense. And he was buried. And literally, by the way, he buried him. And so that first he probably refers to God. I don't know why they chose to translate this in a non-literal sense. But the text seems to imply very directly that God buried Moses. God buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no one knows his burial place to this day. Notice the use of the phrase "to this day." Deuteronomy will use that phrase over and over again. And it has force because a long time has passed. Something has happened and it's been like that forever. Some large amount of time has passed between when the person wrote this and when these events happened and when the person wrote this. So again, this is not a critique of the Bible to say it's not written by Moses. We're just taking the text seriously. The text doesn't say it was written by Moses. It says it was written by somebody else. So we just take the text seriously. It tells us a little bit most. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And listen, never since. He was unequaled in all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants in his entire land. And for all the mighty deeds and all the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Never since doesn't have power or force of authority unless the person writing this lived a long time after. And he's recording what he has been told or believes or is inventing Moses to have said. We don't know which of those three, right? I know as a matter of faith, you can believe he's recording authentically what Moses said. But if we're just looking at the text, all we know is this person lived a long time later, and he's recording what he believes Moses said, or he's at least making a claim of something Moses may have said. So, is there hints? And this is another one of the interesting questions you can now ask is if there are hints about authorship in the third person narrative frame. Are there hints about authorship in the first person elements? Because if he's just direct, and that will tell us something about the nature of the text. If he's just quoting a book that Moses has already written, that's already there, right? Some pre-existing text of Moses. If he's just quoting it, and he had it sitting in front of him, there should be no extra hints about his own authorship in that. If, however, he's paraphrasing or he's using his own words to describe something, that if he's telling a story, and people do this all the time, and I'll give you some examples, right? It doesn't mean that he's necessarily lying. He could be just paraphrasing and retelling in his own words the story. But if he's doing that, there might be hints of dating and authorship even in the first person elements. Now, let me give you an example. When I said this happens all the time, and it's not always evidence of specific deception. I wanted to give like an example, something like this. This is Old Paths, White Cloud by Thich Nhat Hanh, and it is a retelling of the life of the Buddha. He is using the sources that he has at his available to him, namely the sutras. So we have writings of the Buddha that claim to be writings of the Buddha, right? But they were sitting in front of Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh is certainly not trying to be deceptive. He believes those writings are authentic. Whether they are or not is a discussion we can have. But Thich Nhat Hanh believes they're authentic. So he has an authentic transmission of Buddhist texts that describe what the Buddha's life was like and what the Buddha said. The problem is those texts fill about three bookshelves. If you tried to put them all here, they would fill this entire back wall. And so what he's trying to do is tell the story to a Western audience. So not only is he translating those texts in English for us, he's paraphrasing. And so the Buddha said is all through here, and in each instance he's got something in the sutras where he's drawing this idea from. The Buddha would have said something like this, but he's summarizing, paraphrasing, and simplifying to a great degree, and we know that's what he's doing, right? He's not lying, he's not tricking us, like everyone knows that's what he's doing. The problem might come if that library behind me burned, and this is all that we had left. Somebody might pick this up and go, he's claiming the Buddha said this. And if we find out, but yet, there's elements of this that seem to be from his own time period, therefore the whole thing is a fake. That's sort of what we are doing with Deuteronomy. If Deuteronomy is a text like this one, which is an option. I'm bringing this up as an option. It is also possible that the author of Deuteronomy made up some of the statements of Moses to fit his own theology, his own ideas. But there is lots of good evidence in the text itself, internal to the Book of Deuteronomy, that indicate he's drawing from earlier traditions. In fact, the fact that his story of Moses both agrees with what we see in J, E, and P, and is slightly different from what we see in J, E, and P, indicates that he has some sort of authentic or old tradition about Moses' life that he's drawing from. It's something that already existed in the days that he wrote this story. People already knew who Moses did. They already told stories about what Moses said, and he's drawing all those stories and putting them in his own words of some sort. And when I say putting him in his own words, this is partly because of the dating of the Hebrew text. The age of the Hebrew text, the age of the third person framing, and kind of how you can tell how when things were written by sort of words they use. And if they say, man, that was bad, it's probably written in the 80s. This sort of thing. You can kind of date text. When you do that, you find that the third person frame and kind of the first person stuff in the middle seems to all have Hebrew of a similar date, a similar age. So he's clearly taking older traditions. We know that by the fact that it's similar to J, E, and B, but he's also putting them in his own words, which is the only way to explain kind of the aging of the Hebrew text. Let me give you some examples of how the text in the first person sections tells us something about when it was written. And because he loved your ancestors, he, God, he chose their descendants after them, and he brought you out of Egypt with his own presence. Notice something about this. He brought you out of Egypt with his own presence, by his great power, driving out before you nations greater and mightier than yourselves, to bring you and give you their land for a possession, as it is still to this day. A couple things about this. In the narrative, he is speaking to the second generation. Correct? He did not bring the second generation out of Egypt. The whole point of the 40 years wandering was that those people all died. This is a bunch of people he did not bring out of Egypt. But the text says he brought you out of Egypt. And then he says he conquered all these nations for you and settled you here, as it is still to this day. So in the first part of that, he sounds like he's talking to the first generation. And in the end of that, he's talking to people maybe in the time of the 7th century, when we think the text was written. And yet he just flows naturally between the two. Again, as it is still to this day implies a great amount of time has passed since the conquest. So he's brought the past into the present and the present into the past. So acknowledge today and take heart that the Lord your God is in heaven above and on earth beneath. There is no other. Keep his statutes and his commandments, which I am commanding you today, for your own well-being and for that of the descendants after you, so that you may long remain in the land which the Lord your God has given you for all time. This flexibility of time, you can, again, I've seen this interpreted as if it was a slip-up. Like the author thought he was writing for Moses, but once in a while he slips up. And he writes about his own time. And that's his evidence that it was actually written later, but it was a mistake on the author's part. I believe it wasn't a mistake. I think he's doing this on purpose. And I believe that because he's, in a little bit, we'll get to an example where he's explicit about what he's doing and why. I am making a covenant sworn by oath, not only with you who stand here with us today before the Lord our God, but also with those who are not here with us. You know how we lived in the land of Egypt. Do you? They're all dead. You know how we lived in the land. Notice how he's talking to the first generation. No, we lived in the land of Egypt, and we came through the midst of the nations through which you passed, and you have seen their detestable things and filthy idols. Therefore, don't worship their idols, right? They, and indeed all the nations, will wonder, why has the Lord done this to the land? Why cause the great display of anger? And they will conclude, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. They turned and served other gods, worshiping them, gods whom they have not known, and whom he has not allotted to them. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against the land, and brought out every curse written in this book. Brought, past tense, curse written in this book. This is interesting. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger, fury, and great wrath, and cast them into another land, as is now the case. Now, the other one said, as is now the case, you are settled in the land. And this one says, as if now the case, you were exiled. That's interesting. So we have part of the book in the first person sections of Moses that seem to imply the book was written before the exile. Here we have a passage that looks to me like it was written after the exile. But the purpose of the book, why it was written, was to, if we put it in the context of these time periods, it's to do one of two things. If we believe the book is pre-exilic, the purpose of the book is to get people to keep the covenant so they won't be exiled. If it's post-exilic, its purpose is to explain why the children of God were exiled in the first place, because they broke the laws written in this book. So if you believe Deuteronomy is pre-exilic, like the earlier passage, again, the explanation is keep the covenants so you don't get exiled. If you believe it's but that means that the exile was imminent when the text was written. So that dates it for us, imminent just before the exile. If it's post-exilic, again, its purpose is to explain why they were exiled in the first place. We'll put all that together in just a bit. I believe this has to do with what we call the presence of the past and the present. In verse 1:6, the Lord God spoke to us at Horeb. This is the same thing we always saw. He didn't actually speak to the second generation, but he's talking to the second generation as if God had spoke to him. What's he really doing? He's speaking to this pre-exilic or post-exilic people as if God had spoken to them. Right? You see what he's just done? Watch this one. This is where he becomes explicit about this. Moses covenanted all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and the ordinances that I am addressing to you today. You shall learn from them and observe them diligently. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us. So if you're in the second generation, standing there at the entrance to Sinai, that passage makes sense. He didn't make it with our ancestors, he made it with us. In other words, you must each consider yourself as if you were part of the Exodus generation. But if you live in the 7th century, it still makes sense. He didn't make the covenant with our ancestors. He made it with us, who are all of us here alive today. The Lord spoke to you face to face at the mountain. You may not know it, but God spoke to you face to face at the mountain, whether it's through the book or through your own religious experience. Don't just rely on, it was a thing for my ancestors. It's a thing for you. And at that time, I was standing between the Lord and you. Not only were you there, I was there with you, or I've come forward into your time, and I'm speaking to you today. It's like, I'm not the one talking to you. Moses is here talking to you today. Right? So Moses is talking to you through me, and he's here with you today. He stood between the Lord and you and declared to you the words of the Lord. You were afraid because of the fire and did not go up the mountain. And he said, the 10 Commandments. Because God spoke those 10 Commandments to you, not just to your ancestors, but to you. I was there with you. You were there with me. The past, the present are all brought together. The text is, it's hard to say that this is a slip up when in verse 3 he makes it explicit what he's doing. I believe this movement through time is intentional by the author, and in fact you can see it as maybe the reason Judaism has done as well as it has. I'm getting ahead of myself, but The text, to summarize what we've just gone through, there's a lot of text. I read a bunch of stuff just to summarize. The text speaks to the second generation as if they were there in the first generation. It speaks to later generations like us, or the authors at the time the book was written in the 7th century, as if they were there with the Exodus generation. Occasionally Moses speaks as if he were living in the 7th century with the people he's talking to through the writing of this book. Thich Nhat Hanh does the same thing. He has the Buddha speak as if he was living today, and every once in a while he'll talk straight at you, an American in the 20th century. And it seems to be intentional. But it also then allows us to have hints about the book's authorship. We can look for hints in the themes and try to see what that says about when it was written. Again, I believe this is important. There's a phrase that Jews today will often say, that they'll say every generation is the Passover generation or the Exodus generation. And what they're doing is paraphrasing Deuteronomy. They get that idea from this text. And I would claim that this is why Judaism has been so successful. Judaism is a group of people who have tried to see themselves as a covenant people. And again, this comes from Deuteronomy. They are covenant people who have a special relationship with God through this covenant that their ancestors made. But yet they live in exile, most of them. As Jerusalem was destroyed and they wandered the world and they lived in different places. As they lived in exile, how did they keep that sense of identity? And the answer is they thought of themselves as the Exodus generation. They were able, through stories like this one and through the Passover celebration every year, to put themselves into the shoes of the Exodus generation and experience it again themselves, and to make a covenant with God themselves, renewing that covenant their ancestors made, but for themselves each time over and over again. And it's become a very powerful element of their religion and a very important piece of it. But all these hints about when it was written let us finally kind of conclude this picture of how the text was put together. J and E have the oldest Hebrew. At some point, J and E were combined into a single text. We don't know when, but there was what we called the JE redactor. So JE were combined, and then someone wrote Deuteronomy. They had access to J and E when they wrote Deuteronomy, it appears. At some other time, someone wrote P. It's up for debate, but a lot of people will think Deuteronomy was written first, P was written second. But I've seen that swapped. A lot of people think P is post-exilic. If Deuteronomy is pre-exilic, then that doesn't make sense. You have to bring P back further as well. But I think that also makes sense. P could very well be pre-exilic. P has a lot to say about sacrificing in the temple, which makes the most sense if the temple is still there. Then, how do we deal with this fact that there are passages in Deuteronomy that seem pre-exilic, but there are other passages that seem post-exilic? Well, the standard trick is to assume that Deuteronomy was revised at a later date. So there's a pre-exilic text that is the core of the text, and then Deuteronomy 2, we call it, he comes in and he revises the text at a post-exilic date. But we don't know that, right? That's an assumption that tries to make sense of things. It makes sense. Maybe it's what happened. I don't know. But it seems to make some amount of sense. But either way, there is this Deuteronomic tradition that was written either right before the exile or right after, or both. And that is where the book of Deuteronomy comes from, which is combined by a redactor, R, into what we call the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, or the Pentateuch. But we also have this thing called the Deuteronomistic history. And really that's Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. If you read those books, they flow one right after the other. And I think it's a mistake to put Deuteronomy in with the Torah. That's kind of a bold thing to say. But it belongs with the Deuteronomistic histories. I believe those books were part of a series that told Israel's history. It started with Moses, but Moses then told the story of the Exodus. They started with these speeches of Moses, wherein Moses told the story of the Exodus until Moses' death. Then Joshua conquers the land. Then the judges rule, and the kings are established in David and Solomon. And we move through the kings of Israel up to the time of Josiah, and then the exile. And so those volumes of Israel's history, from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, are all a single element. And so even though Deuteronomy, the D source, is a source that we have not seen yet in our study of the Pentateuch, it will become the most important source in everything that comes after. Because we'll be reading mostly from D from here on out until we get all the way through 2 Kings. And that's what's known as the Deuteronomistic histories. And again, when we talk about authors, sometimes I call these things authors, I call them sources. We don't know what they are. They could be a school, a tradition. It could be like they're the Baptists and the Methodists, and the Methodists wrote this book and the Baptists wrote this book, and then someone later who was just kind of a non-denominational Christian put them all together. Right? So we could be finding word usage that is common to a specific person, an author. We could be finding word usage that is common to a certain school who wrote a book or a tradition, or again, we don't know exactly what these sources are, whether they're authors, traditions, schools, but they're clearly distinct and separate witnesses to the text. So what do we see in D that shows us that it has different authorship than the other? Well, the mountain where they get the Ten Commandments is called Sinai in J and P, but it's called Horeb in E and D. We also notice that the place where Yahweh puts his name to dwell, he either puts his name or tents his name, causes his name to dwell in a place. Every time that shows up, it's in D. Lengthen your days in the land. 11 of 12 instances of that are in D, and one of the others is in a recitation of a law, which may have come from the Deuteronomistic tradition. With all your heart, with all your soul, whenever that's said, that's about keeping the covenant with all your heart and all your soul, and loving God with all your heart and your soul. That's always in D, always. And to go after other gods, to turn to other gods, to worship other gods, 13 out of 13 times that shows up, it's in D. Listen to the voice of Yahweh, 12 out of 12 times, it's in D. They have different ritual and theological concepts. So for example, from P, only Aaron's descendants are priests. Levites are some sort of a lesser priest or helper of some sort, but he never mentions the judges. That's P. But D, he always talks about the Levitical priests, with no distinction made between Aaron's priests and other priests. All priests are just priests. E does the same thing. And judges are very important to D. That's why the D's tradition writes the Book of Judges. And so for him, you inquire the priest or the judge, or the priest and the judge together. And P, written by a priest, kind of feels like the judges should get out of the way so the priest can be important. This sort of makes some sense. Now, we have in the text lots of doublets, lots of repetitions. When we split those doublets and repetitions out, we find that the language, the age of the Hebrew, and these sorts of unique word usages all split nicely and evenly. It's not like we chose the splits to make these variations, although sometimes we use the word use to figure out which author, which source to ascribe something to. But it's not like we split them in order to make 13 out of 13 of references to go to other gods be in Deuteronomy. That just happened. And the only explanation for this, and the way other doubles of stories split nicely in this way, to me, has to be something akin with the documentary hypothesis. It is fashionable to say that no one really believes the documentary hypothesis. It's kind of fallen out of fashion, that sort of thing. That is not true. What has happened is that there are all sorts of variants and slight, the addition of, D1 and D2 and some of these kind of fine-tuning, and people debate some of the details, and people argue about the dating of P. Is P post-exilic or pre-exilic? But the general idea that there are at least 4 main sources of text and they are distinct and unique, I think is almost universally accepted by everyone except some very fundamentalist, by fundamentalists. These books are also connected to other books of the Bible. For example, J and E has some sort of connection to Hosea. And all we're saying here is that the prophet Hosea probably belonged to the same school who combined J and E. Well, J also has some sort of connection to what we call the court history of David. That's some of this material in 2 Samuel. Now, 2 Samuel is part of the Deuteronomistic history, but again, he's using earlier sources. So somehow The Deuteronomistic history is when he's compiling the history of the house of David, he borrows from a source that has something akin to J. J and that source are related. Ezekiel was clearly written by somebody who belongs to the P school. Ezekiel thinks about priesthood and all this other stuff the same way P does. So P is related to Ezekiel. Ezekiel comes from the P school. And D has this stark connection to the book of Jeremiah. When was Jeremiah written? Right at the exile. Right? So this concept D is either written just before the exile or just after the exile. Well, here's another evidence. It is connected to the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah probably belonged to the same school of thought of people who wrote D. It is also, therefore, connected, as we said earlier, to the other Deuteronomistic histories, the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua, Judges, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st, 2nd Kings. So each of these sources, once we finish next month with the Pentateuch, we'll be done kind of with that part of the documentary hypothesis. But it is worth pointing out that these schools have impacts on some of the later books, which we will cover as well. Or we could say it the other way, the later books evidence the different schools who also origin pieces of the Pentateuch. Now comes the exciting bit here. Let's talk about Josiah and this book of the law thingy. Hold on one second. Let me get my text here. And maybe we should read, let's see if I can find this quickly. Yeah, let's do this first. Go ahead.
Before you start on that, I'm just chewing on this idea of about the past and the present merging and creating a text that does that. And I was imagining some late 19th century American orator after Lincoln has died, and him or her giving a story of America to an audience and talking about our ancestors did this.
Yep.
And we are this, you are this, and even going so far as to say, and Lincoln told you so and so and so and so.
Yes.
Lincoln is still alive, or Lincoln tells you so and so.
Yep.
And taking those kind of liberties with, we're all Americans, we're united with our ancestors.
I was thinking of doing that sort of thing with the crossing of the Rubicon and George Washington, and Americans admit that they chopped down the cherry tree. I wish we did, but admit it, I mean. But this is the same idea, right? The Constitution binds all of us as if we were there at the Constitutional Convention, as if we had all voted for it. You could do this sort of thing. And it would make for a very powerful sort of text. And so for those who couldn't hear, he was mentioning how you could have a story today about Abraham Lincoln speaking to you as if you were there and as if he was here. What would Abraham Lincoln say if he saw our world today? That's sort of what Deuteronomy is doing. But he's combining the first generation, the second generation, and the 7th century generation all together and letting Moses speak to all of them from the perspective of an author in the 7th century. So Deuteronomy, now that story that we just told gets a little bit more complicated because Deuteronomy has this reference to a book. So when Moses had finished writing down the book, the words of this law to the very end, this law, because Deuteronomy is its own thing, he probably is just referring to the speeches, right? The 3 speeches of Moses probably formed a book. He speaks them and then he writes them down, probably. But he talks about writing down the book. This is actually where this idea that Moses wrote the entire Pentateuch comes from, because they had been combined together, so people got to this part and they're like, oh, look, Moses is writing down the whole thing. But since Deuteronomy is its own thing, he's probably writing the 3 speeches of Deuteronomy. So he writes down this book, and then he says, take this book of law and put it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and let it remain there as a witness against you, because I know well how rebellious and stubborn you are. And let's see, stubborn you are. If you already had been so rebellious towards the Lord, while I am still alive among you, how much more after my death? And assemble to me all the elders of your tribes and your officials, so that I may recite the words in your hearing and call heaven and earth to witness against them. All that is the stuff we saw in the Caesarean treaty format, right? The witnesses and And then it says, "For I know that after my death you will surely act corruptly, turning aside from the way that I have commanded you. In time to come, trouble will befall you, because you will do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger through the words of your hands." Again, when was this written? Probably someone's trying to explain why, the Exodus happened. The exile happened. It says, "I know that in the future you will act corruptly." So let's tell the story of the future when they act corruptly. And there is a connection of some sort between the book of Deuteronomy and this character in 2 Kings known as Josiah. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidiah, daughter of Adiah of Bozakath. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. I should point out, this is the only king in this entire list of kings who the author doesn't complain about at all. He's perfect from this author's perspective, which implies to me that this was kind of written in that time, because what you always say good things about the king who's alive when you write this stuff, right? But anyway, in the 18th year of the king Josiah, the king sent Shaphat, son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, they like all these genealogies, right? The secretary to the house of the Lord, saying, "Go up to the high priest, Go up to the high priest, Hilkiah, and have him count the entire sum of the money that has been brought into the house of the Lord, with the keepers of the threshold that have collected from the people. And let it be given into the hand of the workers who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. And let them give it to the workers who are in the house of the Lord, repairing the house. That is, to the carpenters, the builders, the masons, and let them use it to buy timber and quarried stone to repair the house." So one of the first things Josiah does, and this is why, of course, the Bible likes him, is that after he grows up, he takes all the tax money he's got and all the money that was gifted to the temple, and he gives it all to the carpenters and says, "Please fix this up, because the temple is run down. Let's make it pretty again." Right? And then 8, the high priest Hilkiah said to Shaphan, the secretary, "I have found a book of the law in the house of the Lord." Okay, so wait a minute. They're cleaning up the house. They got to fix the temple because it's become run down. And the high priest goes into the temple and he says, "I found a book there." What did we just read in Deuteronomy? We read about Moses writing a book, and then they take the book and they put it in the Holy of Holies next to the ark, because God knows that in the later days, people are going to become wicked and stop keeping the commandments. So to make sure that they remember the commandments, we're going to write this down and put it in the temple so it can be found later, so they can keep the commandments, because we know they're not going to, right? Okay, so they find this book, and Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan and said, "Read it." And then Shaphan, the secretary, came to the king and reported to the king, "Your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it in the hands of the workers and have oversight of the house of the Lord." And Shaphan, the secretary, informed the king, "The priest Hilkiah has given me a book." And Shaphan read it aloud to the king, and the king heard the words of the book of the law, and he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded the priest Hilkiah, son of Shaphan, son of blah, 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 the secretary and the king's servant, saying, "Go inquire of the Lord for me, for the people, for Judah, what will happen because we've broken all these commandments." And they find a prophetess. I love it. There's a female prophetess. They find a prophetess. She inquires of the Lord, and she says, "Jerusalem and all of you will be destroyed and taken captive because you broke the commandments of this book that you found in the temple." And they're all really sad. And then he says, "But Josiah, because you're fixing up the temple and you're a decent guy and you're doing all you can to keep the commandments, this will happen after you die. You will be gathered to your people, and then Jerusalem will be destroyed." And lo and behold, that's exactly what happens. He's gathered to his people, he dies, and then Jerusalem is destroyed. This is squarely in what we would consider the historical element of the Bible. We've gotten to the point where the characters who show up tend to be historical. Josiah is one of those weird characters who we actually don't have any seals from. We don't have his seals on jugs and stuff. We have them for some of the kings before him and some of the kings after him, but not for him. That could mean he didn't exist. It could just mean that he was right up against the exile, and maybe a lot of this stuff was destroyed. Maybe we'll find something from him tomorrow. But it's in the section of the text where we know stuff before it and after it is historical and verified from other sources. So this probably really happened. That may have just given us the name of the Deuteronomic author. Maybe. You can think of this maybe as kind of an Old Testament Book of Mormon. I have to use that example just because it's the example that comes most to mind for me, right? Here's a person who's trying to convince people of a certain theological point, so he writes a book, but claims it was by an older person, but he includes in it authentic traditions. There's hints of its authorship date. If you read the text looking for it, you can find evidence of its 19th century authorship, just like we can of Deuteronomy. But we also find evidence of much older stuff that he's quoting from, older traditions and thoughts that he's quoting from or borrowing from, or that are in the air around him that he brings into the text and mixes with it. I don't know. The connection between that book and the book of Deuteronomy itself is itself unclear, because the book of Deuteronomy describes the writing of the book. Josiah finds the book. We don't actually know that the book he finds is Deuteronomy, or whether it was the whole law. We don't know what he found, but it is provocative, especially since the dating is right. And the way 2 Kings describes Josiah as a righteous king, how does it prove that Josiah was a righteous king? It uses wording from Deuteronomy. Every commandment Deuteronomy gives for how a king should be, it mentions that Josiah was like that. So either the book was written to justify Josiah's kingship, or this text about Josiah was written in light of the book of Deuteronomy to show you why Josiah was a good king. But there is a connection in wording, in dating, in time period between Deuteronomy and Josiah, and there is a connection. Oh, and by the way, what does Josiah do to prove he's righteous, among other things? He immediately shuts down all the pagan temples. That would be one thing. But he also shuts down all the temples of Yahweh everywhere except at Jerusalem. That's the other main connection between Josiah and the book of Deuteronomy, because the book of Deuteronomy is one of the only of our texts that says you can only worship Yahweh at the temple in Jerusalem. Other places are unauthentic, and you can't worship God in other places. The centralization of worship is one of the key themes of the book of Deuteronomy, and it's one of the things that Josiah does. Probably, I would say, not for purely altruistic reasons. I mean, if you centralize the worship, you gain power and control over the religion. That's sort of what seems to be happening here. But both of those concepts are connected to Josiah and Deuteronomy. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering how much trouble theologians, scholars, apologists, whatever, have had over the centuries explaining how Moses' book got lost, in the temple where there's been priests for generations.
Yeah.
And suddenly gets found.
So your question was, how do theologians explain the loss of the book and then the finding of the book? I would argue that if it was J, E, and P, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because those things are much older. They were written, J.E. at least was written at an earlier date. It was in the air, right? I don't think you could lose those things. The text's own internal explanation of this is that the king, before Josiah, persecutes the worshipers of Jehovah, Yahweh, and shuts down the temple and boards it up. And what Josiah is doing, among other things, is opening the temple back up, cleaning it up. That's why it needs repair, and he repairs the temple, and they find a copy of the law kept in the temple. I can't imagine that some priests didn't wander off with copies as well. There should have been lots of copies. The surprise at having found this thing, from my perspective, that implies that it was authored at that point, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that you could find something that was such essential part of your worship that wasn't in many locations, many copies. It is confusing to me as well.
Speeches of Moses before he died.
These are the speeches
of the future.
And more important, I think, there are other speeches of Moses that clearly were in circulation. This is a unique set of those quotes that suddenly comes to light. And again, it has authentic references to earlier traditions. We know that. In fact, some of the oldest stuff we have comes from Deuteronomy, comes to us from Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy preserves some of the oldest traditions about Moses. But that doesn't mean those traditions weren't compiled at a later date and put into this one book, because I can't imagine the book just appearing out of nowhere without anyone else having remembered it after just 2 generations of persecution. Because we're not that far from Hezekiah, who was a righteous king, and Isaiah, right? Isaiah at least would have not have just allowed this book to be forgotten, right? It doesn't make sense. So from my perspective, I have the same problem, right?
Well, I'm thinking about ministers in the 1700s and 1800s and 1900s who would have seen, oh, well, this book got lost and then it got found. And what did they say?
I don't know. Again, for me, this implies the authorship happened at that date. Your question was, what did these people in the 17th century say when they saw this? I mean, it strains credulity. I agree. I don't know what they thought. From my perspective, it implies to me that it was written at that point. Yeah.
Yes, I'm curious about various words and concepts for worship, because the claim is being made worship should be done only in Jerusalem. But lots of people aren't in Jerusalem and are doing their own thing or whatever. So what variations
Very good.
in following that come up?
What do we mean by the centralization of worship? Because people clearly can worship God anywhere. From D, he doesn't mean prayer. You can pray to God anywhere. He doesn't mean reading the law. You can do that anywhere. He's specifically talking about temple type worship, the offering of sacrifices, and the celebration of things like the Passover, and so the festivals and the sacrifices. You can only offer the sacrifices on that altar in Jerusalem at that temple. You can't sacrifice to God in other places. Now remember the story of the priests of Baal and what's his name? This is going to be embarrassing, but I'm having a senior moment. What's the name of the guy who goes up to Mount Carmel and has the battle with the priests of Baal and calls lightning down from heaven? That's a sacrifice authorized by God, as evidenced by the lightning from heaven outside of the temple. But D did not write that, right? Because from D's perspective, that sort of thing doesn't happen. You only sacrifice in Jerusalem at the temple. And so it's a centralization of sacrifice. And what we have in the archaeological record are a whole bunch of these little temples all over with altars where people were sacrificing to Yahweh. We know that. There are lots of temples to Yahweh, and in the Bible they're called the high places. But these high places sometimes have syncretic worship of Yahweh and Asherah or some of these other Canaanite gods, but they were authentic early forms of worship of Yahweh. So from the Bible admits they existed, but from the Bible's perspective, they're apostate and need to be stopped. But again, when I say from the Bible's perspective, it's in Kings. This is the Deuteronomistic history's perspective that these we need to. And I think part of it is worship God alone. Monotheism is a big deal to D, and if you allow these other temples, the worship of Yahweh gets mixed with these other gods, and that's what he wants to put a stop to. And so the best way to do that is centralized worship in Jerusalem. But it also centralizes the power of the king, Josiah. If you have to come to his city to worship and to offer sacrifice, then that increases his political power. So what is this book Deuteronomy that we have? Is it a book written by Moses that was found in the temple? Probably not written by Moses, because the Hebrew is too late, and it has evidence that as it is to this day, clearly even in the first person parts, there are references to later dates. Is it a copy of Moses' words with a frame at a later time? No, sorry, the first one, is it a book completely written by Moses? No, the third person frame, right? We know that. Is it a book with Moses' words with a third person frame around it? Probably not. Again, because even in the first person stuff, there's references to this stuff. However, it does preserve, we believe, some ancient traditions. So is it an independent witness of the Moses tradition? You can compare it complete with all of the sort of things we would expect from an independent witness. Contradictions, differences, similarities. Yes, to some extent it is. Is it a deception to support Josiah and his reforms with no reference to earlier traditions? probably at least not with the no reference to earlier traditions. And I'll show this in next month's class, but there's some parts of this book of Deuteronomy that are really old. Is it a retelling of existing Mosaic traditions, intentionally putting the past in the present, the present in the past? I think that's what it is, but it may also have, as the author did that, they may have intentionally chosen and sculpted those words to support their current king, the monarch Josiah and his reforms, and then the finding of the text may have been deceptive. I don't know. It's very hard to reconstruct this part of the past. But something in those last two, the retelling of the existing Mosaic traditions and this sort of finding of the book that may be deceptive, is probably going on here. And that leaves us with that last question. What is the connection to the book and the law found in the temple? And we don't know for sure. But it is certainly compelling, but not conclusive. That's the way I would say that. I want to circle back to one of those main themes before we're done. And that is this transactional theology that we find in the book. By transactional theology, I mean you make a covenant. If you're good, you're blessed. If you're bad, you get punished. If you misapply this transactional theology, you end up with this idea that whenever a bad thing happens to somebody, it's because they were sinning. That's where this comes from. It's very Deuteronomistic. And it's problematic. It's problematic in many ways. And the rest of the Bible doesn't treat suffering this way. Job has a very different answer to this. So does Proverbs and the Psalms and the New Testament. You know, who did sin? This man or his father, that he was born blind? Nobody did sin. Sometimes bad things just happen because we live in a fallen world, and the Bible recognizes that fact, if Deuteronomy itself doesn't. So Deuteronomy is has a transactional explanation for the problem of pain. Bad things happen because you were bad. But that is not universal in the biblical text. It is in this text itself. And it's in this text because of the context we see. It's all about this treaty. And it's borrowing from the Assyrian suzerain treaties, which are all about, if you keep this commandment, I will protect you and fight for you. If you don't keep this treaty, I'll come and I'll kill all your women and children, and right? And when we get to the curses in the book of Deuteronomy, they are very gruesome. These are not the sort of things you read with your 3-year-old as part of daily Bible study to make us all happy and happy and smiley. These are gruesome things. And they're that way because they're modeled after this suzerain treaty. And they served a purpose in the text, and they've served a purpose in Judaic worship to date. This idea of recovenanting with God and treating God as our suzerain instead of the Assyrian king is one of the things that allowed Judaism as a religion to survive the Exodus, the exile, And it's from Deuteronomy. So it served a purpose in the history of Judaism that is very profound, but it is also not the answer to the problem of pain. And when we treat it as the answer, we get things like that, really perverse things like the prosperity gospel that shows up in modern American Protestantism, where we're rich, we're wealthy, because we're just more righteous than everybody else. Right? And this is what I would consider a form of pride that the rest of the Bible would very much look down on. There is something we can say for this idea that if you do what's right, chances are you'll have a better life than if you do what's wrong. On average, that's what we mean by doing what's right. These are the things that lead to a prosperous society. You can think of it as karma if you want, in the Buddhist sense. But we say it on average, with the understanding that people can do exactly the right thing and bad things can just still happen to them. Because sometimes bad things just happen. No matter how well you plan, no matter how good you are, no matter how kind you are to others, sometimes bad things can happen to you. And I think the Bible recognizes that fact. We just have to read the Bible holistically instead of Deuteronomy with kind of narrow focus. So next time, now that we've kind of covered the themes of Deuteronomy, the authorship, where it came from, this whole thing with the book, which I still don't know, I think I have fully figured out. I don't think we know exactly what happened, but we've got it placed in time, history, and we've got some of its theology down. Let's read some parts of it, and that's what we'll do next time. The likely date for this class will be July. I might be on travel. I said I was going to be on travel this time, and this class might not happen, but travel was postponed. You know how things go. Experiments are delayed, and so I might be gone next month. If I am, I'll try to give an email with as much warning as possible to cancel the class. But if my travel again is delayed, I'll be here, and we'll have the class in July. We'll talk about the Shema, Deuteronomy 6. We'll talk about the king and the law in Deuteronomy 17. We'll talk about these two really old pieces, the Song of Moses and Moses' blessing of Israel in Deuteronomy 32 and 33. These are pieces that seem to be some of the oldest stuff we've got in the Bible. They have important implications for how monotheism came about and how Israel kind of came about as a nation. Very important stuff. We'll talk about the death of Moses and introduce Joshua and get ready for Joshua after that. There may be some other passages. I'll try to make a list of the stuff we want to read, but we'll pick some of the highlights from the book and we'll read some highlights and discuss them next time, and then we'll be ready to move on. So two lectures on Deuteronomy, this introduction, and then we'll read some pieces next time, and we'll move on to Joshua. So any final questions before we quit, or comments or thoughts or concerns, issues? Yeah, Tyler.
I'm thinking about Judaism and Christianity and the place where this idea of if you sin, you're going to be punished, your descendants are going to be punished, etc. Does that play out today differently on average among an American Jew versus an American Christian?
I don't know. So the question was, does the prosperity gospel idea play out differently among American Jews and American Christians?
Well, the punishment side.
Yeah, the punishment side specifically. You know, if you do these things, then you and your ancestors, your children, your children's children will be punished. I don't know. I don't know enough about American Judaism. I mean, I have a general concept of Judaism, but American Judaism is quite diverse, and they have been influenced by the Protestants around them. But I don't know enough about the different sects to say. There could be a sect that has borrowed the prosperity gospel and been influenced by it, but I will say some of the Jewish traditions that I'm well aware of reject it flatly. I mean, especially the ones who've really read and understand the Bible. Like, they're well aware, and in fact, the Talmud is well aware of the fact that there are multiple explanations for the problem of pain in the text, and they embrace the complexity and the contradictions. Job has a different answer than Proverbs, and they know that. And that's some of the richness of the text to them, is these contradictions. Now, them being these specific Jewish traditions that I have interacted with. But American Judaism is diverse enough that I can't speak kind of in a uniform way about all American Jews. I just don't know.
Well, I'm thinking about the paradox that evangelicals in America have the whole New Testament to use that Jews don't. And yet evangelicals, on average, I think, tend to believe more in punishing those who have been wicked.
Yeah, so this is the idea that evangelicals have the New Testament, and Jewish people don't, and yet the Jews are often have a broader interpretation of kinder interpretation of punishment than some of these evangelical Christians. I would add, though, that the Old Testament doesn't have a clear statement on an afterlife, and so this idea of eternal fire punishment is a Christian thing, borrowed from the Zoroastrians, and I think that influences the Christian tradition. The Christian tradition has a much more merciful portrayal of God if you repent and worship Jesus, but it also has this fire stuff in it that Judaism sort of lacks. I mean, there are hints of it in Judaism, but not like we see in the New Testament. And so I think that might explain some of the evangelical stuff. But what is interesting to me is that the evangelicals would, despite the punishment stuff, that sort of makes sense, but that they would embrace the prosperity gospel in a way that Jews don't. since they're getting it in large part from Deuteronomy, and the Jewish traditions that I'm aware of, at least, are much more open to the variety of the material, and don't overinterpret Deuteronomy this way. So I think that is interesting. Okay, well, I hope that what we have shared brings you light and guidance on your life's journey, and I hope to see you next month. And come back and we'll talk about the rest of Deuteronomy. Thank you.